Hey, what's up? It's Cute What If. This side. Today we will be seeing what if Deku was saved by Aizawa one night. Before we move ahead with the FIC, leave a like and subscribe to the channel for future what ifs like this. Hizashi kissed Aizawa on the cheek and told her to have fun on patrol. Aizawa kissed him back. Hizashi called for the children to be good for their father, and Shinso and Eri answered goodbye. Aizawa closed the door, heard it click locked, and set out for her patrol. It was 11 p.m., a time when nothing usually happened, but she still had to make sure everything was okay. She walked toward a quieter, seedier part of town and reached a small, rundown cafe that looked like it might fall apart. Spotting a way to get higher, she searched and found an old, slightly rusted ladder. After a moment's hesitation, she climbed over the edge onto the roof and saw a small boy in dark clothes standing at the edge. He wore a dark greenish hoodie with light tan cargo shorts and red high-top shoes, the hood up so his face was mostly hidden. Aizawa moved closer and looked out over the city, then realized how high the roof really was. The boy stuffed his hands into his hoodie pocket. Aizawa asked why he was there so late. The boy asked why she cared, eyes fixed on the ground. She explained that she was out on patrol and that a child on a roof that high could be in danger. The boy sighed and replied that that was the point. Aizawa stepped a little closer and asked why. The boy answered simply that there was no reason. When she asked his name, he refused to tell a stranger. Aizawa offered that saying she was a pro-hero might help, but the boy said it did not. Loving heroes did not mean he could trust them. She asked his age. He said he was 11, almost 12. Aizawa registered how young he was and wondered why someone so young would want to end things. When she pressed again for his name, the boy groaned and snapped that he wanted to die in peace. Aizawa told him to calm down and that she was only trying to get to know him. He insisted he did not want her to. When she asked about his parents, he muttered that whoever knew or cared, they were hopefully dead and in hell. Aizawa offered to get him something to eat, noting from his raspy voice that he probably had not had food or drink in a while. The boy called it a waste of money, but Aizawa said she just wanted to make sure he was okay. After a long look, he agreed to one meal, nothing big. Aizawa nodded and led him down the ladder. When she asked where he wanted to eat, the boy suggested a nearby bakery with the best sweets. He smiled and started walking south. Aizawa followed. They walked together in a quiet, awkward companionship. Izuku's POV. When they stepped through the bakery doors, Izuku was instantly hit by the warm, irresistible smell of fresh pastries. He knew Aizawa noticed it too. They moved to the counter and were greeted by the worker, Ms. Jody, who cheerfully called Izuku by his nickname, Aizu. Izuku stepped aside after telling the hero to order first. Aizawa replied that they could just use his real name. Izuku admitted that, as a huge fan of heroes, he rarely paid attention to their real names. Aizawa introduced himself as Shota Aizawa and joked that Izuku's confession stung. Ms. Jody offered suggestions for what to try, recommending a double chocolate, jelly-filled, powdered donut first, then a cinnamon-sprinkled strawberry donut, and finally blueberry bagels if the others weren't available. Aizawa laughed and told Ms. Jody he would go with the choices Izuku had suggested. When she confirmed ordering all three, he nodded. Turning back to Izuku, Aizawa asked what he wanted. Izuku hesitated, expecting a joke, but Aizawa patiently repeated that Izuku could choose anything. Izuku asked for a double fudge, caramel-drizzled donut and an iced mocha. Aizawa remarked with soft amusement that it was late for coffee and that he liked this kid. Izuku thought the hero's small chuckle was unusual. He had expected Aizawa's usual stern, cold demeanor. Ms. Jody half-jokingly warned Izuku that she would ban him from coffee someday. Izuku giggled and took a small table by an open window. The tired hero sat across from him. When Aizawa asked about the nickname, Izuku explained that Ms. Jody had given it to him. Aizawa nodded and went quiet, staring out the window beside him. A few moments later, Ms. Jody brought their food, and Aizawa thanked her. Izuku started on his coffee with obvious delight. After a few minutes of silence, Izuku murmured his full name, Izuku Midoriya. Aizawa looked up, surprised, and Izuku clarified that it was his name. Aizawa smiled softly, nodded, and welcomed him, expressing that it was nice to meet him. Izuku finished his food while Aizawa tossed his plate away and commented that the pastries were indeed good. Izuku agreed cheerfully. Aizawa then brought the conversation back to why Izuku had been on the roof earlier, saying that it was usually the part where the kid either went home or explained himself. Izuku grumbled that he did not want to do either. When Aizawa pressed, Izuku deflected by saying Aizawa, as the adult, should decide. Aizawa asked if he looked like someone who could make a proper decision. Izuku suggested going to the park instead. Aizawa agreed and gestured for Izuku to lead the way. Izuku nodded and walked toward the nearest park. Aizawa POV. Aizawa followed the kid to the park, appreciating the quiet for a change. When they arrived, Izuku bolted toward a wooded area, shouting that he didn't want his parents to find him and that it was his responsibility. Aizawa immediately sprinted after him, caught off guard by the sudden dash and the head start. He navigated the trees as Izuku weaved between them, accelerating to close the distance and remarking under his breath that the kid could run. Izuku glanced back, surprised to see Aizawa gaining on him. She shouted at him to ask why he was following, and she explained that she was concerned. She pulled out her phone and called her husband, Hizashi. He answered and, after she told him a boy was running in the woods near the playground, he said he would track her phone and be there as soon as he could. She slipped her phone back into her pocket and kept running. She asked the boy why he was running. He replied that he would be killed if they realized he was gone. He stopped briefly to catch his breath. He asked how she could run so much, and she told him she was a pro hero. She put a hand on his shoulder. He tensed and staggered back, then began sprinting again, slower but still fast. She used her capture weapon to try to trap him, but he moved and it wrapped around a tree. Then a loud booming voice announced that someone had arrived. Izuku looked behind him to see her husband standing next to her. Izuku realized there were now two people there and seemed confused. Hizashi ordered them to stop running and said they would stop chasing. Izuku stopped, which caused her and Hizashi to quickly run toward him. When they caught up, Izuku was breathing heavily. She asked why he kept running when he looked close to passing out. He answered that if they noticed he was gone, he would not be alive much longer. Hizashi showed concern and asked what he meant. The boy pointed at Hizashi and told him not to look concerned. He then leaned against a tree for support and slid down to the ground. She knelt to his level and asked if he was okay, and he asked in a soft, worn-out voice for them to back away. She scooted back a little but stayed near. He asked the time, and Hizashi replied that it was 1:28 a.m. Hizashi asked if the boy's parents were not worried, and the boy said that if his parents knew, they would be worried. Hizashi and she exchanged worried looks. Hizashi proposed taking the boy somewhere safe with her and erase her. The boy mumbled confusedly, and when Hizashi clarified that he meant to take the boy home, the boy just shrugged and leaned his head back. Hizashi asked if something was wrong, and the boy mumbled that he was tired before passing out. They both cursed under their breath in alarm. Hizashi panicked when the boy collapsed to the ground and asked what they should do. She said she would call an ambulance and suggested getting the boy out of the forest. Aizawa nodded, picked the boy up, and commented that the boy was much lighter than expected. They rushed out of the woods and waited for the ambulance. When it arrived, the paramedics took the boy and Hizashi went with them. She took her car so they would not crowd the ambulance, waved briefly, and drove to the hospital. At the hospital, she locked the car and rushed inside. She entered the waiting room and saw Hizashi pacing anxiously while picking at his fingers. She sat down beside him and took his hand to stop him and offer comfort. Hizashi confessed his worry about the boy. She soothed him and told him not to worry. Hizashi murmured that there was something about the boy that made him uneasy and that he just needed to know the boy was okay. She said that if the boy had run that far and kept trying to run, he would be all right. Hizashi smiled, leaned his head on her shoulder, and remained there. She accepted the comfort, finding him tired and endearing. 2 hours later, Hizashi sat in the waiting room with his sleeping, adorable husband. He scrolled through social media until a nurse entered and, reading from her clipboard, asked if anyone had come for Inko Midoriya. Hizashi felt a momentary confusion but recognized the name and waved to indicate they were there. He told the nurse that he and Eraserhead had arrived. The nurse nodded and informed them that Inko was down the hall in room 1-23 on the left. Hizashi registered the pronoun with slight surprise but brushed it off and nudged Shota awake. Hizashi told Shota softly that they could see the child now. Shota, still drowsy, asked whether the child was okay. Hizashi reassured him that the child was fine and stood up. Shota followed as they walked toward the child's room. They knocked before entering. The boy looked up, afraid at first, then calmed when he recognized them. Izuku Midoriya gave a small, uncertain greeting. Shota Aizawa sat in a chair by the bed and returned the greeting. Hizashi Yamada, taking the other chair, told the boy that he had frightened them. Izuku asked where he was. Aizawa explained that he was in the hospital and had passed out in the woods. The boy identified Aizawa as the pro-hero who had paid for his care. Hizashi was surprised that a child knew about underground heroes, and he asked whether Izuku really knew Aizawa. Izuku admitted he did and asked if that was a problem. Hizashi shook his head and got a clearer look at him. Aizawa asked why Izuku had passed out, and the boy mumbled that it was nothing. When Hizashi asked the boy's name, Izuku replied that his name was Izuku Midoriya. Hizashi ruffled the boy's hair and welcomed him. Izuku smiled softly. Izuku then asked why they were there. Aizawa explained that they had brought him in because they had seen him collapse in the woods. Izuku suggested that maybe he should have been left there, and Hizashi reacted with disbelief that anyone would abandon a child. The boy shrank back under the covers and apologized for upsetting them, sounding frightened. Aizawa exchanged a look with Hizashi, and Hizashi softened his tone and told Izuku he had not meant to scare him and that he could call him by name instead of sir. Hizashi introduced himself as Hizashi Yamada. Izuku asked whether they had called his parents. Aizawa said he had not, but the hospital probably had. The idea sent Izuku into a panic. He muttered that his father and his wife could not afford the hospital bill and that his father would be angry. Hizashi asked why his father would be upset, and Izuku began to explain but was interrupted by someone storming into the room. A dark-haired man entered, tossing clothes toward the bed and ordering Izuku, whom he called Inko, to get dressed and leave. Izuku complied, moving toward the bathroom. The man then confronted Hizashi and Aizawa, demanding to know who they were and why they were there with his child. A nurse handed the man the hospital bill and left. The man crumpled the slip of paper, called for Inko Midoriya, and continued in an aggressive tone. Hizashi stepped forward and tried to calm the man, but Izuku reappeared in clothes he had been given at the hospital. The man berated the boy for presenting himself as a boy and moved toward him. Aizawa quickly wrapped his scarf around the man to hold him back and ordered him to stay away from the child. Izuku backed away and hit the window with his back, pleading with his father to stop. The man shouted and continued to struggle. Hizashi went over to Izuku and tried to calm him, pulling him into a hug and assuring him he would not be forced to go with the man. The man grew more violent and used his quirk to threaten them. Aizawa acted rapidly and neutralized the man's power long enough to prevent further danger. A shimmer of energy formed between the advancing threat and the group, and Aizawa took advantage of the opening to subdue the man with a precise, non-lethal takedown. The scene unfolded like something from an action anime. Swift movements, a protective barrier, and a decisive, but controlled disarm that left the aggressor conscious but unable to continue. Once the situation had calmed, Aizawa checked on Izuku, who looked exhausted and nearly asleep. Aizawa gently shook him awake and then asked about his quirk. Izuku, embarrassed, said he did not have one. Hizashi pointed out that a barrier had just appeared to protect Aizawa, but Izuku insisted that the barrier was his father's wife's quirk and that she was not present. He looked around and confirmed her absence, confused. Hizashi asked why his father had called him Inko. Izuku explained that Inko was his late mother's name. His mother had died in childbirth, and his father had insisted on calling him Inko when he learned the child was not a girl, blaming him for the death. Izuku kept his head down as he explained. Hizashi asked whether the boy preferred Izuku or Inko, and the boy looked up and chose Izuku, smiling softly. Hizashi offered to let him change into more comfortable clothes. Aizawa fetched the clothes the boy had been wearing and handed them over. He apologized that the boy's jacket had been torn when he arrived. Izuku asked quietly about his binder. Aizawa said it had been cut up like the jacket. The boy accepted the news in a small, subdued voice. Aizawa gestured toward Izuku's father and told Hizashi he would take the man to security. Izuku nodded and went to get dressed. Hizashi waited in the room while the other matters were handled. Izuku could not believe that the pro-hero present Mike was letting him wear his jacket. He slipped the jacket on, fluffed his hair, hummed in satisfaction, and opened the door. He stepped out to see present Mike pacing. Izuku asked present Mike what was wrong. Present Mike looked up, smiled, and complimented that the jacket looked good on him. Izuku smiled back and asked again why present Mike had been pacing. Present Mike explained that he was just tired and was trying to wake himself up a little. Izuku nodded and slipped on his socks. Izuku asked if his father was going to be arrested. Present Mike knelt to Izuku's eye level and asked if he had anywhere to stay. Izuku said there was his father's wife, but that she was not the kindest. Present Mike gently asked if she or the man had hurt him. Izuku looked away, then nodded, unable to say more at first. Present Mike reassured him that there was nothing wrong with telling others that something bad was happening. Footsteps approached and Izuku looked toward the door as Eraserhead and another man entered. Officer Tsukachi introduced himself and asked if the woman present was Inko Midoriya. Izuku corrected him and said his name was Izuku Midoriya. Izuku asked if he had to stay with his father's wife. Present Mike firmly said no. Officer Tsukachi asked why, and present Mike told him that Izuku had said she and the man had hurt him. Eraserhead looked between Izuku and present Mike. Izuku quietly admitted that they used to hit him and had done other things. He kept his gaze down and could feel the adult's pity, which he did not want. Officer Tsukachi explained that unless relatives could be located, Izuku would have to be placed in the foster care system. There was a look on the two pro-heroes' faces that Izuku could not quite read. Present Mike and Eraserhead said at the same time that they could take him in. Officer Tsukachi reminded them that they already had 2 children and asked if they were sure. Hizashi affirmed that they were. Izuku immediately refused. He told them they had just met him, had fought his father, and now wanted to adopt him. He said he had run from them before and did not want to impose on their lives, and that he would be fine in foster care. Eraserhead argued that Izuku would not be barging in on anything, that they wanted to take care of him, and that the foster care system was flawed. He explained that many children without the so-called perfect quirks were unlikely to be adopted. Izuku stared at him, uncertain whether to believe that anyone cared. Izuku added that Officer Tsukachi had said they already had 2 kids. Hizashi said he was sure those children would love a new brother. Izuku put his hands up in defeat and agreed to go with them, though he warned he might be too much to handle and called himself worthless in a wavering voice. Hizashi could not believe Izuku thought himself worthless. He blamed the boy's home situation and vowed to confront those responsible. Officer Tsukachi handed over the necessary paperwork for the adoption and said he would provide the forms the next day before leaving. Hizashi turned to Izuku and asked if he was ready to go. Izuku asked about the bill, worried, and Shota assured him not to worry since he had taken care of it. Izuku nodded, slipped on his red shoes, and they left the room. In the lobby, Eraserhead whispered something to Izuku before they stepped outside. Eraserhead then picked Izuku up and gave him a piggyback ride. Hizashi called out to his husband, and Eraserhead challenged him by saying the last one to the car would have to drive. Hizashi protested that the challenge was unfair, knowing they were both tired and did not want to drive. Eraserhead had always been the faster runner, but with Izuku on his back, Hizashi hoped he might be slower. When Hizashi turned the corner, Eraserhead and Izuku were already at the car. Hizashi glared at his husband and muttered that it was far too early for their antics. Izuku giggled as he climbed into the back seat. Hizashi climbed in ahead of Shota and locked the car so Shota could not immediately get in. Shota tried and then glared, and Hizashi stuck his tongue out playfully while Izuku laughed. Hizashi finally let Shota in and started the car, and Shota mocked the notion of betrayal toward Izuku in jest. Izuku protested that he was innocent and pointed at Hizashi. Hizashi called it a double betrayal in a theatrical huff, and Izuku giggled. Hizashi noticed Izuku already looking ready to fall asleep. He told Izuku that he could sleep and that it would probably take about an hour to get to their house. Izuku nodded and leaned against the car door, quickly drifting off. Hizashi shook his head and turned toward Shota to ask what he thought had happened with Izuku's quirk. Shota said he was not sure and mentioned that Izuku had said the shield-type quirk belonged to his stepmother, leaving Shota uncertain. Shota suggested they take Izuku to a quirk specialist the next day. Hizashi teased Shota about whether he meant later that day or the following day, and Shota reminded him that it was 3 in the morning. Hizashi kissed Shota's cheek. Shota mumbled a quick reply and fell asleep. Aizawa could not believe how the green-haired boy thought so little of himself. He hoped the new arrangement would help Izuku see his own worth. Aizawa POV. Aizawa felt the car stop and heard quiet chattering. He opened his eyes slowly and rubbed them, taking in the sight of Hizashi speaking with the boy. He had always given nicknames to their children, this one called the boy Problem Child, a name Aizawa used for his other two as well. He greeted them in an exhausted tone, and Izuku asked what Problem Child meant. Hizashi explained that it was what he called Hitoshi and Eri and that it was not meant as an insult. Aizawa yawned and apologized if it had sounded harsh, and Izuku admitted he had only been confused. Aizawa muttered that Namuri would be worried, and Hizashi corrected his grammar with a playful retort. They traded light barbs about grammar and age until Izuku teased that they argued like an old couple. Hizashi shot back that Shota might look old but did not appreciate reminders, and Aizawa, standing and stretching, called them childish in turn. Izuku laughed and stretched too, and Hizashi hoped everyone inside the house was asleep so they might rest. Izuku said he was not tired, which Hizashi found suspicious given they had known the boy less than a day and he was already picking up their habits. Zashi asked Izuku his age and the boy replied he was 11, almost 12, which made Zashi mutter that it made him feel old. Aizawa asked Izuku about medical conditions. Izuku explained that he had anxiety and ADHD and was allergic to bananas, apologizing to Hizashi for mentioning it. Izuku elaborated that Hizashi had once joked the boy looked like a banana when his hair was up for his hero costume, and Hizashi laughed and shook his head. At the front door, Hizashi unlocked it and Izuku paused in the doorway, sniffing the air as if trying to make sense of something. Aizawa asked what he meant, and Izuku said the house did not have the strange, suffocating smell his old home had sometimes had. Aizawa looked at him with concern and asked what the smell had been like, then noticed Izuku reach into his pocket and pull out a small white box. Aizawa and Hizashi both recognized the pack immediately. Izuku said that it was something his father and his father's wife had done and that he had taken them to try. Aizawa asked if he had tried them, his voice firmer than intended. Izuku winced, admitted that he had, and handed the pack over. Aizawa put the pack into his back pocket and knelt to Izuku's level to reassure him that he was not hated. Izuku sighed in relief and murmured an apology. Hizashi told him not to do it again, and Izuku nodded and turned his head. They were then met by Namuri Kiyama, who scolded Hizashi and Aizawa for worrying the kids. Izuku mumbled that he felt at fault. Namuri softened when she noticed the boy and greeted him warmly, starting to announce her hero name before Izuku eagerly finished for her, identifying her as Midnight, hero name Midnight, and naming her quirk. Aizawa muttered that of course Izuku would know, and Namuri bumped Aizawa's shoulder and asked Izuku how he knew so much. Izuku explained that he studied heroes, which made Namuri grin and asked to test him. Izuku quickly recited Hizashi's civilian and hero names, his quirk, and that he was likely married to Aizawa. The statement surprised them all. Aizawa asked how he knew, and Izuku listed 3 observations. Hizashi had called Aizawa endearments in the car, had shown affection earlier on the drive, and had whispered about how adorable Aizawa was. Hizashi protested but defended the truth of those observations. When Namuri asked about Hizashi's quirk, Izuku described its effects and an unusual limitation underground, which made Hizashi uneasy and then mutter in recognition when Izuku said he had complained about it in the car. Aizawa stared at Hizashi, who avoided the look, and Aizawa teased that Hizashi was often adorable but not always bright. Namuri then asked about Aizawa. Izuku recited his civilian and hero names, noting that Aizawa worked more quietly than more public heroes and lacked merch, then explained Aizawa's quirk. He could erase another person's quirk as long as his eyes were open. Hizashi began to exclaim, and Aizawa lightly swatted him down to stop him from finishing a curse. Hizashi squealed at the sudden hand, and Aizawa rolled his eyes. Izuku asked about cursing and Aizawa explained that it was a bad word. Izuku apologized and Aizawa forgave him. Izuku fell silent for a moment and then glared at them, insisting he was not dumb and reminding them he was 11, not 3. Hizashi jokingly called the boy intimidating. Izuku scanned the room and asked about all the pictures on the walls. Namuri answered that Hizashi loved taking photographs. Izuku pointed to a photo of the couple with a child in each of their laps and asked who they were. Aizawa explained that the silver-haired girl was Eri, a couple of years younger than Izuku, and the purple-haired boy was Hitoshi, the same age as Izuku. Izuku nodded and kept looking at the photos, yawning softly. Namuri teased him about being tired, and Hizashi noted that he had just yawned. Izuku denied sleepiness and teased back, asking her to be on his side. Namuri asked where he would sleep, and Hizashi said that since Hitoshi had a bunk bed, the boys would probably share it. Izuku tuned out the rest of the chatter and wandered off through the house. Izuku POV. Izuku watched the family pictures with quiet curiosity and a sense of relief at the calmer atmosphere in the house. He walked toward the rooms to see where he would sleep, thinking about the strange but kind people he had just met. Their house wasn't huge, but it wasn't as small as mine had been. I wasn't sure what I was searching for, so I wandered until I found a hallway. At the farthest door, I stopped and stared. A purple-haired boy who looked like the one in the photo by the front door told me that Papa and Dad usually said to stay away from that door. I turned to see him properly. I asked who he was, though I already suspected the answer. Hitoshi replied calmly that he was Hitoshi and assumed I had come with Papa and Dad. When I asked who Papa and Dad were, Hitoshi explained that he called Hizashi present Mike and Shota Eraserhead. I said that was cool and asked what was behind the door. Hitoshi shrugged and admitted he had never gone in, which made me want to try even more. He confessed. He'd wanted to for years. I introduced myself as Izuku Midoriya. Hitoshi said it was nice to meet me, then walked closer and leaned against the wall. I asked how we were supposed to get in. Hitoshi grinned and handed me a bobby pin. I reacted skeptically and pointed out that they were pro-heroes and should have better security, but Hitoshi only shrugged and motioned for me to pick the lock. Hizashi was talking with Namuri when little Eri tugged on his pant leg. He bent to pick her up and asked what was wrong. Eri murmured that Hitoshi was gone, sounding exhausted. Namuri asked where Midoriya was. Hizashi replied that he had thought Midoriya was right there, but he stopped when he realized the boy had gone missing. Hizashi asked Shota where Midoriya had gone. Shota said that he had gone off wandering. Hizashi nodded and suggested that Midoriya had probably found Hitoshi, who was likely showing him around. Then they all heard a sudden crash and a loud shout from elsewhere in the house. Hizashi thought that was concerning. Hizashi POV. Hizashi heard someone scream from the other side of the house. He set Eri down and told Namuri to watch her. Namuri nodded and picked up the slightly frightened little girl. Hizashi and Shota rushed toward the sound together. They reached a door that was normally kept locked and opened it to find Hitoshi and Izuku chasing one another with wooden practice swords, clearly horsing around rather than fighting. Izuku teased as he ran past them, and Hitoshi answered in kind. When both boys noticed Hizashi and Shota, Izuku murmured that this was bad and Hitoshi yelled for everyone to run. The two boys dropped their practice weapons and sprinted away, as if in a frantic dash. Shota sighed that he would go after them. Hizashi nodded, picked up the scattered practice swords, and returned them to the weapons room, wondering how the boys had gotten in. After closing the door, he went to look for Shota and the boys. Screaming drew him toward another room. There, Hitoshi and Izuku were immobilized against the wall by Shota's capture device, which had restrained them in a non-lethal, slapstick way. Both boys looked terrified. Izuku begged not to be hurt, and Shota, shocked at the reaction, immediately released them. Izuku curled into a ball and began to cry. Hitoshi gave Hizashi and Shota a worried look, then wrapped his arms around Izuku for comfort. Eri somehow wriggled free from Namuri's arms and went to Izuku, and the three children ended up in a small, reassuring group hug. Hizashi stepped forward and rested a hand on Izuku's shoulder in a calming gesture. Shota came down and knelt in front of Izuku to offer comfort. Aizawa POV. Aizawa had not intended to frighten the boy. He apologized to Izuku, explaining gently that he had not meant to scare him. Izuku sniffed and asked uncertainly if Aizawa really meant it, voice cracking. Aizawa nodded and smiled warmly. Izuku returned the smile and hugged Aizawa, who hugged back. Eri asked whether Izuku might be a new brother. Aizawa responded kindly to the question. Izuku answered Eri's introduction by giving his name as Izuku Midoriya, and Eri introduced herself as Eri. Later, Hizashi told the children that it was time to sleep. Hitoshi and Izuku protested that it was only mid-afternoon, but Hizashi insisted that they needed rest. Izuku made a light joke about feeling depressed, and Hitoshi laughed with him. Nemuri teased that the two of them had been scary earlier, and everyone shrugged and laughed nervously at the memory. Hizashi repeated his instruction for the children to sleep. Eri called him Papa and said goodnight, and Hizashi kissed her head in a tender, parental gesture. Eri waddled over to Aizawa and received a kiss on the cheek as she said goodnight, then left for her room. Nemuri announced that she was going to sleep on the couch and waved goodnight. Izuku asked where he would be sleeping. Hizashi teased that if Izuku and Hitoshi had not wandered off with swords, they would already know. Izuku giggled. Hizashi decided that Izuku would share a room with Hitoshi, and both boys agreed. Hizashi hurried them off to their room. Izuku offered to return Hizashi's jacket, but Hizashi told him to keep it since he needed a new one. Izuku thanked him cheerfully and ran off with Hitoshi. Later that night, Hitoshi pulled on pajamas and slipped into bed, and Hizashi changed into his own sleepwear. Hitoshi pulled Hizashi into a warm hug. Hizashi muttered that he was tired, and Hitoshi teased him affectionately before they settled down, holding each other until they fell asleep. Hitoshi POV. Hitoshi rolled over and got out of bed the next morning. He looked up to see Izuku waking as well. Hitoshi greeted Izuku while stretching, and Izuku responded. Izuku asked what time it was, and Hitoshi checked his clock, reporting that it was 7:45 a.m. Izuku nodded and climbed down from the bed without making a sound. Hitoshi pointed out a ladder, which Izuku dismissed as boring. Hitoshi opened the door and led the way to the kitchen. They found no one was already making breakfast. Hitoshi guessed that Hizashi and Aizawa had slept in. He noted that Nemuri was passed out on the couch and explained to Izuku that they called her Auntie Nem. Izuku understood and asked if Eri and the other adults were still asleep. Hitoshi suggested they check on Eri. Hitoshi quietly opened Eri's door and peered inside. She lay sleeping peacefully in her bed. He closed the door and confirmed to Izuku that she was indeed still asleep. Izuku suggested they check on Hizashi and Shota as well, so Hitoshi led him to the room they shared. They opened the door slowly and found both men asleep. They returned to the kitchen to plan their next move. Izuku proposed getting food for the sleeping adults. Hitoshi admitted he did not know how to cook, and Izuku confessed the same. Izuku checked his money and said he had enough for some donuts. Hitoshi smiled and said he knew a cheap donut shop a block away. Izuku got excited and said they should get dressed. Hitoshi offered his clothes for Izuku to borrow, and Izuku accepted. They went to change and headed out together. Nemuri POV. Nemuri woke up to Eri poking her face. Nemuri asked what was wrong. Eri looked at Nemuri and then at Hitoshi's room and said that Hitoshi and Izuku were gone. Nemuri shot up and went to check. As she opened their door, she saw that both were absent and murmured with worry. Aizawa POV. Aizawa groaned at voices and heard Hizashi trying to wake him. Aizawa said he wanted 5 more hours. And Hizashi, slightly panicked, told him that the boys were gone. Aizawa sprang out of bed, concerned. Nemuri explained that Eri had woken them and said the boys were missing. Aizawa dressed quickly, and Hizashi did the same. They put on their shoes and prepared to search the house. Eri stayed in the living room watching television. Hitoshi POV. Hitoshi opened the door and heard panicked voices. He and Izuku glanced at each other and stepped inside, closing the door quietly behind them. They carried the donuts into the kitchen and then followed the noise into the living room, where Papa, Dad, and Auntie were visibly upset. Papa, Dad, and Auntie snapped their heads toward them and rushed over, embracing Hitoshi and Izuku tightly while asking where they had been and saying they had been very worried. Hitoshi and Izuku returned the hug. Auntie explained that Eri had woken Nemuri and said the boys had disappeared. Hitoshi and Izuku told them they had gone to get donuts and that they had left a note in the kitchen. Hitoshi led them to the fridge and pointed at the note taped there. The adults exchanged relieved looks and laughed softly before hugging the boys again. Izuku joked about how many hugs had happened in the last day, and Hitoshi told him to get used to it. Izuku then asked to eat, complaining that he felt like he had not eaten in forever. Dad reminded him he had eaten yesterday, and Izuku mumbled that he had thrown up earlier in the bathroom. Auntie asked where they had gone. Izuku said they had gone to the best bakery in Japan, a pastry shop about a half-hour away. Dad and Papa joked about Izuku drinking coffee too early and being too young for it. Izuku rolled his eyes and said he had been having coffee since he was 8. Namuri teased that was why he was short, and Izuku blamed forgetting to eat as the real reason. Eri rounded the corner and exclaimed excitedly about the donuts. Izuku jumped onto the counter and nearly knocked his coffee over. Hitoshi asked if he was all right. Izuku stuck his tongue out and jumped off the counter without making a sound, then shrugged and sipped his coffee when Namuri wondered how he did that. Later, Papa told Izuku, nicknamed Green Bean, that they would visit the quirk doctor. Izuku asked why, insisting he already knew he was quirkless. Dad said they were just checking something. Izuku shrugged and grabbed another donut. Hizashi told Hitoshi and Eri to be good for their father, and they answered that they would. He then grabbed his keys and opened the front door. Izuku asked where they were going, and Hizashi explained that they were going to see a quirk doctor to find out what Izuku's quirk might be. Izuku nodded and got into the car. Hizashi offered to play some music, and Izuku said he did not mind, so Hizashi turned on a random radio station. As Hizashi pulled out, Izuku noticed something move in the shadows of an alley. Hizashi asked if something was wrong, and Izuku looked back but saw nothing, so he said there was nothing and Hizashi shrugged and kept driving. Hizashi asked what kind of quirk Izuku thought he had, and Izuku shrugged and said he thought he had nothing. Hizashi responded that Izuku clearly had a quirk, but Izuku explained that he had been told so many times that he did not have one. Hizashi said nothing further and continued the drive. At the clinic, a receptionist asked how she could help, and Hizashi said they were there for Izuku Midoriya's appointment. The receptionist checked the schedule and told them the doctor would see them shortly. Hizashi led Izuku to some seats in the waiting area. The clinic's decor was spare, with a few small paintings. Hizashi tapped Izuku's shoulder and offered to let him hear a new song he had been working on. Izuku accepted, and Hizashi handed him an earbud. Hizashi watched Izuku listen and then ruffled his hair, complimenting him. The rhythm of the song made Izuku tap his foot, and after it ended he suggested a change to tie the ending together. A nurse called Izuku's name and told them that only Izuku should follow. Hizashi agreed but did not look entirely keen. Izuku followed the nurse down a hall into a room marked 12 and was told to sit tight. A few minutes later, Dr. Kai Chisaki entered and introduced himself, saying he would run a few tests and provide results afterwards. He explained that he would take some blood and perform another test. Izuku nodded and looked around the room. The doctor drew blood from his left arm and explained that the vial would help determine the type of quirk. He then produced a small tube of light green liquid and asked Izuku to hold still as he injected it into his right forearm. Izuku winced slightly but remained still while the doctor set the empty tube down and said they would wait a minute for it to take effect. To pass the time, the doctor asked about Izuku's age and family. Izuku told him he was 11, almost 12. When the doctor asked about his family, Izuku said he did not have one and then said he had come with someone who would be watching him. The doctor noted the vagueness but did not press further and explained generally how the test would proceed before leaving the room. After a short wait, the doctor returned with a piece of paper and said that the tests were done and he would provide a rundown of Izuku's quirk. He handed Izuku the results and then left the room, smiling in a way that caught Izuku's attention. Izuku shook off the thought, left the room, and returned to the waiting area. Hizashi, who had been on the phone, did not notice Izuku at first. When Hizashi finally looked up, he started in surprise and remarked that Izuku had scared him. Hizashi asked what Izuku's quirk was, and Izuku said he did not know. Izuku read the page briefly, then quickly tore it up and threw it away before Hizashi could see. Hizashi asked if something was wrong and Izuku muttered that it was the same as he had always said. Hisashi looked unconvinced but did not push the matter. He suggested they go home, and Izuku agreed. They drove home listening to the radio, and during the trip Izuku drifted off to sleep. While he slept, his thoughts turned to his quirk and he felt a familiar, sinking doubt about his own worth. Hitoshi mumbled Izuku's name tiredly from behind him. Izuku turned from the window to face his brother. Hitoshi asked quietly how Izuku felt about going back to school. Izuku answered softly that it did not feel horrible. Hitoshi walked over and handed him a blanket, saying he was just wondering. Izuku accepted it. Hitoshi grinned mischievously and suggested stealing their father's coffee, and Izuku muttered that he was in. They moved slowly and quietly into the kitchen. Their father was on the phone when they arrived, so they hid behind the counter and listened. Their father argued firmly with the person on the other end, insisting that Izuku would not be placed in foster care. Hisashi stepped forward and asked who was being discussed. The father clarified that Izuku could not return to that household. The caller said they had already offered to take him and asked how long the arrangement would last. After a pause, the father agreed but warned that if anything happened, Izuku would be returned to them. Hitoshi and Izuku exchanged shocked looks. Hitoshi whispered, incredulous, that no one was seriously going to take Izuku. Izuku admitted that he did not know and felt afraid at the thought of the household their father had mentioned. A few hours later, lunch was ready. Their father called the children to the table. Izuku remained wrapped in his blanket and said he was not hungry. Hitoshi offered to bring him food later and left the room with a worried sigh. He sat at the dining table, picking at his plate and avoiding eye contact. Their father asked where Izuku and Eri were. Hitoshi explained that Izuku was in their room and that Eri was taking a short nap. Their father asked Hitoshi to bring Izuku down because they needed to talk. Hitoshi returned with Izuku following him, and they sat quietly side by side. Their father spoke gently and said they needed to tell Izuku something. Izuku replied in a low voice that he already knew. Hitoshi explained that they had overheard his father's conversation that morning. Their father and Papa exchanged looks. Their father, with sadness, explained that Inspector Tsukachi had arranged for Izuku to live with his father's wife for the time being. Izuku stared at the table and acknowledged the news with a flat okay. Hitoshi asked how long this would last, and their father answered that it would continue until they could properly adopt him. Hitoshi stood abruptly and slammed his hands on the table, accusing their parents of breaking a promise to give Izuku a home. Their father responded quietly that the situation was complicated. Izuku tried to reassure Hitoshi that it would be okay, but Hitoshi refused to accept it. Their father promised Izuku that as soon as they could, they would bring him back. Izuku whispered that he believed them. A knock sounded at the door. Hitoshi opened it to find a red-haired woman and a brown-haired man standing outside. The woman announced that they had come for Inko Midoriya and spoke with a cold tone. Hitoshi told her there was no Inko at the house. The woman insisted that there was and demanded the child. Hitoshi called for their parents. Their father and Papa entered, followed by Izuku. The red-haired woman urged Izuku to come with them, and Izuku emerged and stared at her. He gave Hitoshi a quick hug before stepping toward their father and Papa for a brief embrace. Their father whispered something to Izuku and then released him. Izuku asked softly for Hitoshi to wait for him, and Hitoshi nodded, promising that he would. Izuku looked back, gave a sad smile and a final wave, and then followed the strangers from the house. It had been almost 2 years since Izuku had stayed with the two pro-heroes. He was not even sure if they remembered him. He was 13 and in his second year of junior high. It was the end of the school year and classes had let out hours earlier, yet he stood on the school roof. He had tried this about 2 years ago and had been stopped by a hero. That would not happen this time. All of the pro-heroes were away at a major fight across town. Everything up here was quiet and still. Nothing bad was happening. He was not getting beaten or bullied here. He was not being used or lied to here. He was not being hurt. He slowly took off his shoes and set them neatly beside his bag. He stood and stepped over the railing, then sat on the edge with his legs dangling. He told himself he would succeed this time. He heard shuffling behind him but no voices called out. He let it go and remained standing. He told himself that nobody would miss him. He leaned forward and began to fall, then stopped. He cursed under his breath and told himself not again. Hisashi POV. Hisashi and his husband were walking home after getting groceries. Eri was with her best friend Koda, and Hitoshi was at home playing video games. The neighborhood was quiet except for news of a villain attack downtown. Hisashi asked Shota if the heroes might need help. Shota replied calmly that if they needed help they would send a signal and there was no cause for worry. Hisashi nodded and continued walking. Shota then pointed to a dark silhouette on a roof and asked if Hisashi saw the figure. Hisashi suggested someone was just enjoying the view, and Shota muttered uncertainly. When Hisashi asked if something was wrong, Shota admitted he had a bad feeling and said his gut told him something was off. Hisashi looked back to see the figure stand, and he tried to reassure Shota that the person might simply be leaving. The figure suddenly fell. Because Shota had been cautious, he had brought his scarf and quickly used it to climb a lamp post, waiting for the right moment. Hisashi stayed below, ready to help if Shota missed, hoping that everything would be okay. A short time later, the scene shifted to the person on the roof waking up in a hospital. Izuku POV. I slowly opened my eyes, shut them against the bright light, and pulled the covers over my head. I heard voices and recognized Present Mix immediately, which made me freeze. Present Mike reassured me that there was nothing to be afraid of. Moments later, Ingenium asked my name. I peered out and recognized him, and told them that I knew who he was. Present Mike teased that I was a fan. Another hero joined in with a light remark. I asked why I was in the hospital and why pro heroes were there. Present Mike explained that they had seen me fall from a roof, caught me, and brought me to the hospital because I had multiple cuts on my arms. I nodded and muttered that I could not even die properly. Ingenium asked why I felt the need to die. I shrugged and said I was hurting and had wanted to end it. Eraserhead, stern and tired, told me that I could not try to kill myself without giving people a reason to help. I replied that I had no intention of sharing my traumatic past with strangers. Officer Tsukachi then entered and identified himself, saying he was there to question me about what had happened. Ingenium asked why I had jumped. I answered that I was hurting and had wanted to end it. A blonde hero asked why I had left with someone with red hair years ago. I said leaving had been safer than being hunted. Eraserhead asked why I had bruises, and I said I got hurt. He asked why I had cuts, and I said I had wanted them. They asked whether I had a quirk. I said no. When they accused me of lying, I denied it. The adults stared. I asked if they were done, and the officers said they were not. I stood and left the bed despite Ingenium's warning not to walk around. At the front desk, I asked the receptionist if I could sign myself out. She asked if I was 18 or older. I said no and walked away. The heroes hurried after me. I ran through the hospital and complained that they always seemed to love to run. Ingenium began to catch up. He reached out to grab me. I grabbed his wrist, twisted it, and pushed him away before sprinting again. One of the heroes shouted and asked why I was running. I shouted back that I did not want to live in that hell and pushed myself harder. I made a sharp turn and ducked into an unfinished, abandoned apartment complex. I ran to the top floor and hid behind a partially built wall, squatting and trying to slow my breathing. Present Mike called softly for me to come out. I shook my head and scanned my possible exits. Jumping was an option, but it could leave me badly hurt or worse. The thought of escape and its dangers closed in on me as I peered around the corner and watched the pros search below, convinced they would find me and take me back. The boy muttered no, then louder no, his voice breaking into a terrified plea. He begged not to be taken back. He whimpered that they had found him, panic tightening his breath. Aizawa POV. Aizawa and the rescue team kept searching for the boy, calling out and listening for any response. All they could hear from the ruins were mumbling and erratic breathing. Aizawa called out and then turned to look behind a broken wall, where he found the boy scratching at bandaged arms and rocking back and forth, muttering to himself. Aizawa knelt in front of him and waved a hand near his face to get his attention, asking if he was okay, though he already suspected the answer. The boy trembled and stared up at him with pure fear. The boy kept whispering that he did not want to be taken back. Aizawa cradled him in his lap and rocked him gently, rubbing circles on his back and offering quiet comfort in a soft, paternal way. The others watched with pity. The boy immediately pushed back, insisting he did not need their pity, that pity was for the weak and he did not want to be weak. Hizashi knelt and rubbed the boy's back to reassure him that he was not weak, though the boy answered with a frightened and angry murmur that whoever had hurt him had always said otherwise. Ingenium asked who those people were, and the boy tried to insist it was nobody. The boy stood and brushed off his hospital gown. Aizawa noticed the scrape on his knee and pointed it out. The boy had not even registered the injury. Hizashi asked why he had run. Izuku POV. Izuku responded that he did not like questions because he had been told not to answer, and he did not like talking about his quirks. He added the last part in English. Hizashi realized the boy had spoken English and quietly acknowledged it, surprising Ingenium. Yamada asked in English why he disliked talking about his quirks. Izuku said, also in English, that one quirk was very weak and the other was not something he wanted to talk about. He fidgeted with his hospital gown and began to wipe blood from his scraped knees. Aizawa suggested taking him back to the hospital, but Izuku refused. He explained his fear of hospitals, the sterile whiteness, the smells, the helplessness of trusting strangers with his life, and the memories of people dying in hospitals from accidents beyond control. These practical fears and the associations they carried made hospitals unbearable to him. Izuku snapped his head up when Aizawa shook his shoulders to get his attention. Aizawa asked if he was all right, noting that the boy had been mumbling. Izuku recoiled, not from the touch but from fear of being hurt, and quickly apologized, pleading that he did not mean to cause trouble and asking not to be harmed. Aizawa reassured him that no one would hit him and asked why he would think that anyone would. Izuku explained that he had been punished whenever he had done something before, and the fear in his voice wavered between anger and vulnerability. Aizawa asked him to step away from the edge of the broken building and promised they would make sure he would not get hurt. Mike added a quiet, sympathetic voice to the reassurance, and Izuku felt the sting of pity, which only reminded him of his own perceived weakness. When Izuku asked for a promise in English, Aizawa met his gaze and promised to help and protect him. Izuku accused them of lying and of being unwilling to help, stepping back toward the edge in panic. He lashed out verbally, calling them fake heroes with fake promises and claiming he could not trust them. He accused them of making promises like that before and failing to keep them, explaining that he had left because he had felt like a burden, a toy, a weak and useless nobody who had been used and harmed repeatedly. He said people had always told him things would get better, but in his experience, they never had. The boy sank to his scraped knees and began to sob uncontrollably, the pain and fear spilling out in a raw, childlike way. The team moved closer, careful and steady, while Izuku trembled with dread and tried to push away the overwhelming sensation of hurt. They stayed with him, grounding him in the present and making sure he would not fall. A neutral pause followed as the rescuers prepared to help him to safety. Nobody POV. It did not take a genius to tell that something terrible had happened to the broken boy in front of the heroes. They were trained, but none of them had faced anything exactly like this, and at first they did not know how to act. Their fatherly and older brother instincts took a moment to kick in. Tensei had a little brother but had never dealt with this kind of situation. Hizashi and Shota recognized the boy and had cared for him before, but something had clearly been done to him, and the knowledge that they might have prevented it made guilt settle heavy in the room. Izuku Midoriya had changed over the years. The once hurt but still innocent boy was now fragile and withdrawn. He bore many scars and bruises, some were recent, others older. His emerald hair had darkened to a deep forest green, freckles had multiplied, and his skin was noticeably paler. His eyes looked dull and broken, his voice raspy and fragile. Bandages and dressings covered parts of him. A pale scar crossed his left eyebrow, not deep enough to affect his sight. Many marks came from the side effects of one of his quirks and from testing gadgets he had built to distract himself. Viewed as a reject by society, he had become his own friend and refuge. He had taken up building and tinkering, turning leftover scraps into small creations, anything to distract from his problems. In his head he constructed a life that could have been. A kind mother who was alive and loving, friends, perhaps a little sibling, a pet. He imagined happiness and being valued, never dismissed as useless. Instead of the harrowing process he had once endured, he imagined simple, ordinary joy. The heroes stared at the boy and moved slowly toward him, trying not to startle him. The broken boy told them to stay back, his voice barely holding together. He did not look as scared as he sounded. What showed through was not fear but pain, an all-encompassing ache he wished would end. An explanation followed in the narrator's mind. The pain came from a chip implanted in his lower back. When he had been taken away by a red-haired woman and a brunette man with gold eyes, he had been subjected to procedures that left him in constant distress. The people responsible included Kai Chisaki, who had acted as the doctor, and Izumi Midoriya, who had worked as a receptionist and was married to Hisashi Midoriya. When Izuku had been brought to their place, the implant had been placed in his body. It contained a tracking mechanism and a small vial of faint purple liquid. When either Izumi or Kai activated the device, the liquid released into his bloodstream and triggered overwhelming pain. The effect overrode his senses. Sight, touch, taste, hearing, and smell were flooded until all he perceived was agony. It did not kill him. Instead, it induced a phantom-like pain and artificial chemical disturbance in his nerves that made his brain believe he was experiencing intense burning and distress. It was a cruel manipulation that left him consumed by pain without visible wounds to account for the severity. The heroes were clueless but followed the situation carefully. As they approached, they heard him whimper in pain. It hurt them to hear it, and they could only wonder what was causing such suffering. The scarred boy stammered that he had been good and tried to swear it, then began scratching at his lower back as if to claw away the feeling, pleading for it to stop before he went limp. Aizawa's perspective was a steady, worried presence. He admitted to himself that he had panicked when the boy fell limp. From the look of him, it was clear the boy had been through a lot, and Aizawa could not shake a sense of responsibility. When Izuku passed out, everyone rallied, alarmed and protective, moving to his side to find the cause. They found only the visible injuries and a few scraped knees. Nothing obvious explained the severity of his reactions. Aizawa suspected a panic attack, or something chemically induced, but he did not know for certain, and the uncertainty ate at him. When Izuku opened his eyes again, he found himself in a hospital room. He groaned inwardly about waking there once more, grabbed his head, and sat up. He heard soft voices nearby but chose to ignore them at first. Looking around, he recognized the same three pro-heroes from earlier and reacted with a touch of sarcasm and theatricality, clapping his hands between words as he insisted that they hated him. Mike responded playfully, saying that two could play that game, and another hero, clapping in mock sync, told him that they cared about him and that he deserved support and affection. Izuku argued back with the same dramatic clapping, denying their concern even as the exchange revealed an undercurrent of care and protectiveness around him. Ingenium joined in the clapping. Eraserhead slammed his hand against the wall and shouted for them to stop clapping so loudly. Present Mike spoke quietly that there was no need to be rude. The narrator lost composure and laughed uncontrollably, mostly at the expression Eraserhead made. Time passed, courtesy of a lazy pause in events. Later, the narrator spoke up softly and addressed Eraserhead and Present Mike with a question. Eraserhead asked if the narrator meant to be called Problem Child, and Present Mike explained that Hitoshi was doing fine, that he missed the narrator, and that Sho called Toshi by that nickname as well. The narrator asked what would happen when he was discharged. Eraserhead replied that the narrator could either return to those people he had mentioned or come with them, and made it clear that he would not allow him to go back to those people. Eraserhead sipped a cup of coffee the narrator had not noticed. The narrator said he would rather stay with them than return to those people. Present Mike responded cheerfully that sounded good to them. The narrator complained that hospitals made him feel confined. The adults laughed and agreed that hospitals could be strange. Ingenium concurred. The narrator asked if he could leave several times. Ingenium, the blue-haired man, told him not yet. Eraserhead answered no. Present Mike teased with a grin and again said no. Aizawa began to grow more annoyed and insisted no more forcefully, while Present Mike laughed and Ingenium tried to suppress a chuckle. The narrator pouted and crossed his arms. He began to address Sho but trailed off. Mike teased that the kid was mad. The protagonist huffed that he was being a brat. The protagonist then accused Mike of being a depressed-looking emo while glaring at him. Mike looked shocked but returned the glare. After a couple of minutes, Hizashi shook his husband to break the staring contest. Ingenium continued laughing as he watched the whole thing. Still glaring, the protagonist picked up an ice cube. Hizashi pushed Shota's hand away and said that he did not care. In response, Shota gave a light tap to the back of Hizashi's head and protested sharply. Hizashi protested back and then exaggeratedly flopped onto the floor, putting on a dramatic show. Shota shook his head with a look of disapproval at Hizashi's childish antics. Hizashi pretended to cry, accusing Shota of betraying him with that endearing expression, and the gesture made Shota's face flush. Izuku scoffed and rolled his eyes, then told them to take the argument elsewhere. Shota muttered that he hated them both while glaring, and Hizashi retorted with a joking complaint that he hated himself more, goading Shota like a playful rival. Hizashi was not sure whether the comment had landed as a joke. Tensei, known as Ingenium, mumbled that he had a dark sense of humor and told them to get over it as he stared out the window. He shrugged and then asked if he would die if he climbed out the window. Izuku observed that, given they were on the 4th floor, he probably would, and Tensei admitted this softly, a flicker of concern in his voice. They sat in an awkward silence until the kid suddenly snapped his head around and smiled so brightly it was unsettling. He trailed off and began to mumble incoherently. Izuku shook him lightly to break him out of his trance, and the kid's eyes snapped back. Izuku asked if he was all right, mentioning that the kid had been mumbling. The kid apologized, explaining he had not done that in a while and had tried to bury the habit with his dreams, though apparently it had not worked. They all stared at him for a moment before moving on to another random topic. Shota asked what had changed. The kid responded too calmly that, other than practically everything and his will to live having left his body, nothing much had changed. Izuku asked if they should be concerned, and the kid cheerfully said no. Izuku then talked about his radio show doing even better, how he had managed to get more people to appear on it, and that he had been working on a bunch of new songs, rambling a little as he went. Hizashi teased that Izuku was starting to ramble like him. Izuku protested that Hizashi was throwing him under the bus, and Hizashi screeched that Izuku now knew how it felt. Izuku offered an exaggerated apology, and Shota yelled for them to shut up while managing to smack them both. Izuku and Aizu screeched in response, loud even without their quirks, since Shota tended to erase them. Hizashi then declared he was done with the two of them, and Shota remarked that they made such a dysfunctional family. Hizashi sighed and agreed. Izuku admitted he was bored. Shota asked why that mattered, and Izuku practically shouted that he wanted to leave. Hizashi teased him about his phrasing, and Izuku snapped back not to correct his grammar. When Izuku asked when he could leave, Hizashi said they could sign him out once the paperwork was in order. Izuku said he could not sit still. When Shota asked why, Izuku replied that he had ADHD and ADD. Shota nodded and returned to his phone. Izuku begged to be allowed to leave now. Shota explained they could not sign him out yet because they were not his legal guardians. Izuku hissed that he wanted to leave now and picked at his bandages. Shota told him to stop picking at the bandages, and Izuku sassily told Shota to stop looking like a hobo and then they could talk. Hizashi suppressed a giggle and reminded Izuku that he really should not mess with the bandages. Izuku called him a traitor and flopped back onto the bed. A knock sounded at the hospital room door, and then Izumi stood next to Izuku's bed. Izumi told Inko to get up and that they were leaving. Izuku responded that he was not leaving without the two pro-heroes, pointing at Shota and Hizashi. Ingenium had left earlier to go home, so only Shota and Hizashi remained. Izumi snapped who the two were, and Shota identified himself as the pro-hero Eraserhead while Hizashi introduced himself as the pro-hero Present Mike. Hizashi smiled falsely and asked who the woman might be. The woman returned the smile and identified herself as Inko's mother, Izumi Midoriya, apologizing for any trouble her daughter had caused. Shota replied sharply that Inko was gone and that the young person with them was Izuku, not her daughter, and that she was not his mother. The woman glared but kept her practiced smile and insisted that kids these days pretended to be someone they were not. Shota hissed that he did not know what she was talking about and pointed out that the young person was male and that his name was Izuku. Izuku looked at them and smiled softly. The woman growled that they were leaving now and reached for Izuku's hand roughly. Izuku protested, and Shota and Hizashi reacted quickly, prying her hands away. Shota asked the woman politely to leave because Izuku did not want to go with her. The woman shouted that the child was hers and that she had legal custody. Security officers rushed in and detained her, dragging her away. Hizashi and Shota turned back to Izuku and saw that his bandages had come loose and some of his old injuries had reopened. Izuku apologized and said the woman had grabbed his wrist too hard. Hizashi told him not to apologize. A doctor entered and asked if everything was okay. Shota explained that Izuku's old injuries had reopened. The doctor nodded, cleaned and rewrapped the bandages, and disposed of the old ones. She told them to let her know if they needed anything and added that Officer Tsukachi should arrive soon as requested. They thanked her. Izuku asked why Tsukachi was coming. Present Mike explained that they intended to adopt Izuku officially this time. Izuku stared a moment to make sure they were serious, then offered a genuine smile and thanked them. Shota ruffled his hair and they began another light conversation. Hitoshi woke and went to the kitchen, starting his usual coffee routine. He noticed a note on the fridge and read it aloud to himself. The note said that Dad and Pa were out for the day and would be back later. If anything happened, they should be called. Namuri was watching Eri, so there was no need to worry, and to stay out of trouble. Hitoshi set the note aside and continued with his morning. He flopped onto the couch and turned on the television. The white-haired cat Sassy padded onto the couch, curled into his side, and meowed. Hitoshi explained that Dad and Pa had left for the day and that Eri was with Auntie Namuri. The cat nodded in her way and purred as he stroked her, and he returned his attention to the show. In the car, Izuku greeted Hizashi and asked if they still had the weapons room at the house. Hizashi trailed off, unsure why Izuku asked. Izuku then asked if he could surprise Hitoshi for fun. Shota clarified that Izuku meant Hitoshi when he said eye bags. Yamada agreed that it would be fine as long as no one was hurt. Izuku grinned and began forming a mischievous plan. Yamada admitted privately that he felt uneasy about Izuku's smile. Shota admitted he was scared too but thought the prank would be funny. The group bickered and teased one another as they drove. Izuku suddenly shouted at Yamada to focus on driving, and Yamada realized he had been distracted while Shota slept. Izuku had unbuckled and reached between the seats to steer for a moment. Yamada put his hands back on the wheel and apologized, promising to pay attention. Izuku launched into a worried string of questions about the adoption, how it would work, whether the other adults might return and take him away, and what would happen if they weren't there. Shota calmed him, explaining that they would speak with Tsukachi the next day to make the adoption official, that they planned to sue to prevent the previous guardians from regaining custody, and that Hitoshi would be involved with school arrangements to keep Izuku settled. Suddenly Yamada swerved to avoid a cat in the road. He pulled over and everyone got out of the car. Izuku and Shota hurried to check on the animal while Yamada shut off the engine and waited. Izuku found the small animal lying in the road and knelt beside it. It did not appear to have been struck, but it looked unwell, and he stayed with it while the others gathered around. The cat was so dirty and muddy that it was impossible to tell the true color of its fur. The narrator noticed a sharp, metallic scent and suspected the animal had been injured. Aizawa crouched beside the narrator and inspected the kitten. He noted that the cat did not look well but said he did not think the narrator's child had caused the injuries. The narrator slowly reached out. The kitten lifted its head weakly and nuzzled the palm. The narrator begged to take the animal somewhere for help. Aizawa agreed and told the narrator he would go inform Yamada, advising to carry the kitten to the car very carefully. The narrator removed a beanie to cradle the kitten, which meowed and then sniffed before settling into the narrator's arms. Back in the car, the narrator cradled the small animal and murmured that it was so young. Aizawa suggested taking the kitten to a vet, and the narrator reassured Yamada that he had not hurt the kitten and had, at most, scared it. Yamada nodded and started driving. The narrator hoped the kitten would be okay and watched the animal's heterochromatic eyes, one a misty moon gray, the other a sea blue. The kitten's pained expression struck the narrator emotionally. The narrator reflected that, while not having gone through the very worst, they still understood suffering and had always had a soft spot for kids and animals. The kitten already seemed to trust the narrator, and the narrator intended to care for it. If the vets did not help, the narrator vowed to make sure the kitten received proper care. Hizashi announced that they had arrived and urged everyone to hurry. The narrator lifted the kitten and hurried into the animal hospital, careful not to cause any further discomfort. At the reception, the narrator explained that the kitten had been found on the road and needed medical attention. Aizawa and Yamada confirmed the account. A nurse came out to take the kitten into the back with the doctors, and the narrator, Aizawa, and Yamada settled into the waiting room. Yamada said he would call Hitoshi to let him know what was happening so he would not worry. When he finished the call, Aizawa asked if Yamada had told Hitoshi that the narrator would be coming. Yamada admitted he had not and said he was curious to see how the narrator would handle surprising Hitoshi. Aizawa groaned and called the narrator a problem child, to which the narrator giggled. Hizashi observed his husband and their future son interacting with the narrator and found it endearing. He thought the kid shared traits with both of them. Holding the small child comfortably in his arms, Hizashi adjusted him so he could sleep more easily and kissed his husband's head as his husband dozed. The family's peaceful moment felt quietly adorable to Hizashi. Later, the narrator woke to find a certain blonde nearby and realized they had fallen asleep on him. The narrator sat up quickly and apologized, but the blonde ruffled the narrator's hair in a warm, familiar gesture that the narrator had missed. The blonde said he understood and noted how hard it could be to sleep in a hospital. The narrator asked if the kitten was okay. The blonde said the doctor had indicated the kitten should be ready to go soon, so he assumed nothing too serious. The narrator felt tired yet strangely full of energy, and Shota, who had also been dozing, complained about always napping and lacking energy while the narrator seemed to have endless energy. The narrator reflected on having a poor sleep schedule and dark circles like Shota, combined with untiring energy like Hizashi, and felt mildly amused by the mix of traits. Plus, I can be pretty loud. I shrugged and scratched my head. A woman with light blue hair in scrubs carried a crate. She walked over and handed the crate to Hizashi a little forcefully, explaining that the animal had slight malnutrition and a few small injuries that had already been healed by someone's quirk, and that otherwise it was fine. She handed a sheet of paper to Shota. I asked quietly why she had used the pronoun it. The woman snapped her head toward me, glared briefly, and then stared at my chest. I shifted awkwardly in my chair and tried to avoid the look. She said the animal was intersex before giving the paper to Shota. The woman then said she did not understand why anyone would bother. It was just a stray and would have died without the rescuer. She added that the sheet contained everything the animal would need but suggested releasing it back into the wild and letting nature take its course, glaring at me again. Hizashi and Shota nodded and stood up. I stood as well and we left. I asked if I could take the kitten out of the crate, using proper pronouns instead of it, because I knew how painful being called it could be. Hizashi nodded and handed me the crate carefully. We climbed into his car and I set the crate down gently. I opened the lid and peeked inside. The kitten peered at me with curiosity but stayed away, fear in their eyes. I smiled softly to reassure the kitten and introduced myself as Izuku. The kitten tilted their head and meowed softly. I told the kitten it was really cute, praised its eyes and soft fur, and asked if I could pet it. The kitten remained wary but slowly walked closer, poking their head out of the crate and meowing. I held out my hand and reached slowly toward the small feline, stopping a couple of inches from its face. The kitten sniffed my hand. Shota looked amused while Hizashi glanced back occasionally and smiled fondly. After a moment, the kitten set their fluffy head on my hand and began to purr. I pet the kitten behind the ears and felt my whole chest light up. I asked whether we were keeping the kitten and whether it would be given away. Shota reassured me that they were not giving it away. I sighed in relief and turned back to the kitten. I asked softly if I could pick the kitten up. The little feline nodded and let me hold them to my chest. The kitten meowed and placed a tiny paw on my cheek. I felt overwhelmed by how adorable they were. Hizashi asked how I had bonded with the kitten so quickly, taking a not-so-subtle photo. I shrugged and kept petting, saying that animals had always liked me even if I did not know why and that I did not think of myself as very likable. Aizawa countered that it had taken about a year for Hitoshi to fully open up to them, while it had taken me only 2 hours. I questioned that comparison by pointing out that Hitoshi was not an animal. Hizashi joked that Hitoshi and Shota were basically cats, earning a glare from Hitoshi and a meow from the real kitten. I asked innocently if I could be a puppy. Hizashi chuckled and Shota told me to be whatever I wanted. I giggled, looked at the kitten, and pretended to be a puppy, giving a playful arf. To some, it was hard to believe I was 13. I was slightly taller than average for my age, about 5'5". I had never really gotten to be a kid, so back off. I was still timid around others, not because I was shy or quiet but because I did not trust or like many people. Shota asked what I was going to name the kitten. I thought about it and said I might ask Hitoshi. Then I asked if we could stop somewhere. They both looked at me strangely before nodding. Shota asked where. I replied that I wanted to go to Party City. Hizashi asked warily what I intended to buy, and I said I had my own money. Hizashi admitted he was worried that whatever I bought might give Hitoshi a heart attack. I reassured him that the kitten would be fine today, though Hizashi only looked more worried as Shota wore his signature grin. Hitoshi's perspective. Hitoshi was surprised they had not come home yet. He had been told about an injured kitten and that they would be delayed, but 2 hours had passed and he was not sure whether to be worried. They were pros, he thought. They should be fine. Aizawa's perspective. Aizawa found it entertaining to watch Hizashi panic over everything I was buying. He thought Hizashi had complained that it was too much and that they were supposed to surprise Hitoshi rather than give him a heart attack. I had said I had not seen Hitoshi in 2 years and wanted to have my fun, offering to pay if anyone objected. I asked Shota for help, and Aizawa returned a grin that answered the question without words. The problem child copied the grin and began listing what we needed. Aizawa groaned at being roped in. Nemuri's perspective. Nemuri asked little Eri if she wanted to go on a small trip. Eri asked where, and Nemuri explained that Papa wanted their help with something. Eri nodded and put her shoes on. Nemuri had received a call from Hizashi asking for help because Aizawa and Minizawa were causing chaos at Party City. She was coming to help, and she was not about to leave Eri alone. At Party City, Eri squealed and ran up to Hizashi. Hizashi smiled, picked the 4-year-old up, and kissed her cheek. Nemuri noted that he was a good dad. Hizashi told Nemuri that the two had gone rogue. Nemuri asked where Shota and Hitoshi were, and Hizashi mumbled that it was not Hitoshi this time. Then a green-haired fluff and a raven-haired man returned carrying 3 bottles of fake blood, and Izuku greeted them enthusiastically. Izuku grinned and asked if they were currently getting supplies to prank Toshi and if I wanted to help. I looked between Izuku, Shota, and Hizashi in confusion, then returned his grin and said I was in, calling him Broccoli Boy. Hizashi half threatened me to stop using that nickname before walking away. I told them I felt very threatened and that I was going to help, then I followed the kid and the adult. Hizashi muttered that this was not good while Eri giggled. I was terrified for my life. They had spent almost $200. I wanted to ask how Izuku, a 13-year-old, had so much money, but I held back. I questioned what they were planning while Eri tried to convince Izuku to get her a gumball. Nemuri grinned wildly and volunteered to join. Shota admitted he did not want to be against the kid, which made me even more nervous. I asked the little listener what he was planning. He just grinned and promised I would see. I told him I was going to restrict how much time he spent with Shota because I wanted one of my kids to be somewhat like me. He beamed that he had inherited some sociopathic tendencies. Nemuri opened her mouth to object but let it go. Eri declared she was like me. Izuku pointed at Shota and said she was more like that scruffy boy. I felt betrayed and objected that Eri was only 4 and we should watch our language. Shota, puzzled, asked what was wrong with the word. I explained that I did not know it was a curse word. Shota asked if I knew what a curse word was. I answered that I thought it meant strong expletives. Shota sighed that half my vocabulary seemed to be curse words, and I apologized softly. Kiyama came to my side and ruffled my green hair, asking where I had learned so many of them. I said one of my friends liked to shout them a lot to seem cooler. Shota asked what I had almost said instead of friend, and I admitted I had meant best friend, but we had drifted after our quirks developed. I explained that I had been diagnosed quirkless for a long time and that had affected how he viewed me. We had made up, but we were not the same, which was a half-truth. I told them I did not want them to know how weak I truly felt. Namuri asked what the plan was. I said I intended to use fake blood and needed either a fake weapon or access to their stock. Shota suggested the fake option since he was not convinced I knew how to use real weapons in the room. I pointed out that there were many things they did not know about me, like being trained to wield knives and having some self-defense. Hizashi said I would spend more time with him so he could soften me up, slinging an arm around my shoulders. I shrugged and muttered agreement. I asked if real weapons were still off-limits, and Shota sternly confirmed no real weapons. I grabbed 2 realistic-looking fake knives and we checked out. We drove back to their house with Namuri and Eri in one car and the 2 men riding with me and my kitten. Once there, I filled everyone in on the plan. I needed the blonde to help and wanted the other 3 to go in and act natural at different times. Shota asked why Hizashi was staying with me. I said I needed him to help with the setup. Namuri asked what we would say if Hizashi asked about his absence at the radio station. I told them to come up with cover stories since they were heroes. Shota admitted he had nothing. Eri cheerfully offered that Papa was at the radio station, which made me note how startling it was that a toddler could fabricate a lie so readily. Eri insisted she wanted to stay with me, and I asked if she was sure. She nodded and smiled. I lifted her onto my hip and told everyone I was ready to do whatever it took to protect my little sister. She giggled and patted my hair, calling it fluffy. I hugged her and strolled with her in my arms. I changed the plan and told the adults they needed good acting skills because Eri was now part of it. Hizashi responded cautiously, and Shota admitted he was worried too. Eri nodded enthusiastically when I asked if she was ready to scare Toshi. Namuri observed that we had created a monster. I confirmed we were ready. I asked Eri to help scare him and motioned for the 2 men to go act natural. Namuri told me she had a name and Eri explained the names she and Toshi used for her anti-Nem, Namuri, or Nem, and Namuri invited Eri to use whichever she preferred. I set Eri down and asked the adults to come up with their roles. A short moment passed as everyone prepared and adapted to the new plan. They nodded and headed up to their house. Inside, the narrator gathered the items and the group moved around back. The narrators said they were ready, and everyone prepared to begin.